Hello, and thanks to all of you for attending today. Hang on a second, technical difficulties. All right. There we go. For those of you who may not be familiar with Cancer and Careers, we are a national nonprofit and the only program of its kind solely dedicated to empowering and educating people with cancer to thrive in their working environment. Today, we will be talking about communicating effectively in the workplace. However, our mission to help people with a diagnosis to thrive is served in a variety of ways. We do so via our comprehensive website, through free publications available in both English and Spanish, as well as career coaching. Additionally, we offer educational seminars which are targeted at employees with cancer and their colleagues, also at healthcare professionals, and we offer HR trainings as well. And currently, we are also in the process of offering some financial assistance grants. We have obviously live webinars like this one, as well as full day conferences, which we'll talk about at the end of the session, and feature a number of articles and blogs and news feeds that can all be accessed through our website. That address is cancerandcareers.org. I encourage you to take a visit, where you can also sign up for our newsletter to stay on top of all of our latest offerings. So a few quick notes about accreditation for those of you who are seeking that information. For those who aren't, I promise I will make this as quick as possible. If you today's program is accredited for CEUs by NASW, the California Board of Registered Nurses, the Association of, the American Nursing Credentialing Center, as well as at New York State's Education Department State Board for Social Work, and SHRM. If you wish to receive credits from these accrediting bodies or a general certificate of attendance with no credit, you must complete the following steps. First, you must have registered for today's session. Second, you must dial in or be logged in to the webinar individually. People who are listening in on someone else's line will not be eligible for credit, or if that's you, log out, log back in. You have some time to do it. Additionally, within 2 weeks of this session, you must complete a post-session evaluation, and you must complete a post-test and earn a passing grade. Links to both the evaluation and the post-test will be sent tomorrow, Thursday afternoon by 5 p.m. Eastern Time, and certificates will be emailed within 4 to 6 weeks. For those of you who are not requesting continuing education credits, we also love hearing from you via evaluation. Your feedback is so important in helping us to evolve these programs and in communicating to our incredible sponsors who help to make today possible. So the Balancing Work and Cancer webinar series is sponsored in part by a generous grant from Genentech. And we are also so grateful for the tremendous contributions provided to us by HSN and QVC. Additionally, Cancer and Careers year-round sponsors support all of CAC's core programs, including this one. My name is Rachel Becker. I'm Senior Director of Programs at Cancer and Careers, and I will be your presenter for today's 60-minute webinar. So, on to our topic for today, communicating effectively, tips and techniques. Now, communicating effectively is, or rather communicating generally, broadly, is something most of us do every day to one degree or another. So from that perspective, it is probably fair to say that everyone on this call has some degree of expertise in their own right. We all know that different people communicate differently for a variety of reasons. We know what it feels like to have a good conversation, whatever that might mean for you. And we can likely all relate to the idea that communication is what gives us the power to connect with others in meaningful ways. But with all of that said, I'm guessing that many, if not all of us on this call, can also relate to the idea that communicating effectively can come with challenges. Some topics are more difficult to talk about than others. Sometimes it's hard to know how to start a conversation or to end it or to move it to a different place entirely. We also each have our own personal feelings about communicating that can play a role in the way that we do communicate. And when it comes to communicating in work-related settings, particularly when cancer is in the mix, there can be all sorts of other added layers of complexity. And it's not always intuitive how to navigate those added layers. So the goal for today, which you likely already know from the title of this session, is to provide you with some tips and techniques and to spend some time thinking about what it means to communicate effectively and to help you feel empowered to do so. So to get this conversation started, we're going to begin from a place of looking at communication basics. And that will allow us to all be thinking together in an organized way and move forward with a shared understanding. So let's ask ourselves and think about the question, what is communication? Well, one definition is that it is a process through which information, ideas, and/or emotions are shared between two or more people. And it can occur in a number of ways. It can happen through audible communication, so communications that can be heard through your ears, such as spoken words, or it may also involve sounds that are not words, such as nonverbal grunting or sighing and things like that. But of course, not all communications are received through our ears. Some of them may be written out, or they may be shared using sign language. Our behavior around others and our body language can also convey information or clues about what we're thinking and feeling. And it's also important to note that sometimes our communications happen in ways that are thought out and deliberate, but that is not always the case. Sometimes we end up sharing ideas or information based on a spur of the moment decision or an impulse. And sometimes details get shared with others unconsciously without us even knowing that we are doing it. Like when we're nervous and our hands start to shake or we start tapping our foot repeatedly. But what we're going to do today is review and unpack some things to think about, various approaches that can help you be more strategic and deliberate in your communications in order to be more effective. Now, being strategic about how you communicate can be helpful in a number of settings that you may find yourself navigating after a cancer diagnosis. And while our bigger focus for today will be on strategic communications related to work, both on the job and when looking for a new job, I think it's important to note that there are areas outside of work-related settings where you might need to or want to use some deliberate communication strategies as well. So for example, I'm guessing that some of you may have already experienced this. It can be very helpful to prepare for any conversations you may be having with your healthcare team. Since there's often only a limited amount of time available during appointments, or if you're admitted to the hospital and a doctor drops by during rounds, preparing a list of questions you have or topics you'd like to discuss can help ensure you make the best use of limited time that you have with them. Similarly, some conversations with family or other loved ones may benefit from advanced preparation, such as sharing news about your diagnosis or sharing updates about your treatment plan. And we're going to spend time talking about disclosure conversations later in this presentation. That discussion of disclosure is also going to incorporate thinking about how we can be strategic when posting things online, whether on social media or on a blog or really anywhere else where you might be sharing, since our online behaviors can have a very real impact in our work lives. So as we move forward, I encourage you to be open to the idea that while a lot of the tips and techniques we're talking about are being shared under the umbrella of being work-related, they may also be used effectively in other areas of life as well. So now that we've talked about the basics of what communication is and where it happens, let's digging into what specifically makes communication effective. And a key concept here is that effective communication is a two-way street and involves both sharing our thoughts and ideas while also investing energy in receiving and absorbing the ideas that are being shared by whomever else we're communicating with. This means not only being mindful to get across our own perspective in a way that's clear and organized, but also really paying attention to what that other person is trying to get across to us and considering what they're bringing to the table in terms of their own perspective. Also, don't be afraid to ask clarifying questions if you're not entirely sure what that other person or people are trying to get across to you. It's much better to make sure that everyone is on the same page up front rather than wishing later that you ironed out details better beforehand. Expressing gratitude when it's appropriate is also a best practice. And while you might assume the person you're communicating with knows that you're appreciative, the reality is that usually people don't know what we don't tell them directly. And simply saying thank you can go a very long way in effective communication. Another best practice can be summarizing what was discussed at the end of a conversation. That might mean taking a minute or two before ending a phone call to review what next steps are, or it might mean sending an email after the fact to say, hey, thanks for the conversation we had earlier, to recap what we discussed, and then just list out whatever it is that you talked about. And this is because effective communication isn't necessarily limited to being a one-time event. In fact, it should be something that happens regularly. We can probably all relate to the idea that life in general and our work tasks or projects, et cetera, they're all continuously evolving and sometimes in unexpected ways. So regular check-ins, whether they're 5-minute overviews or longer deep dives, are necessary to make sure that communications are as beneficial as possible to everyone involved. It's also important to take note that sometimes effective communication very purposely takes place over more than one conversation. Additionally, effective communication incorporates emotional regulation, which means having the goal of staying centered so that what you're feeling doesn't play too much of a role in how you're expressing yourself. And this is particularly important when we think about work communications, because while our family members or loved ones may ultimately be forgiving if we say get angry or annoyed with them, and that starts to come through, sharp words or intense energy on the job quite often lands differently. And sometimes it can have long-term consequences that are hard or even impossible to move on from. Asking for help when you need it is also an essential part of communicating effectively. And every single person on this planet, no matter their health status or their job title or any other personal characteristic, needs help from time to time. So asking for it shouldn't be something that you shy away from, particularly at work. And of course, effective communications should result in a clear understanding of any next steps, whether that's treatment related, that's related to communicating about treatment with your healthcare team, or in terms of a project at work, or plan for taking time off. All of that can be critical to include in conversation. This can all be critical to include conversation recaps that we talked about on the last slide when having those discussions. Moving on to why effective communication is important on the job, particularly after a cancer diagnosis. Well, for one, it helps to keep the lines of communication open. The vast majority of us who work don't do it in a vacuum, right? We somehow collaborate with others in order to get our job done. And so the best way to make sure that everyone knows what they should be doing and when and how to do it and so on is to make sure that information and ideas are moving back and forth freely and regularly. In some cases, someone who may be working part-time during their cancer treatment or who has taken time off and is now returning to their job, effective communications can help remind your boss and coworkers that you're still a valuable and capable contributor to the team. Effective communications on the job can also eliminate questions or assumptions that lead to anxiety or mistrust. For example, if you have a desk type job and are working remotely, either as a reasonable accommodation or because of a decision that your organization made in response to what's going on with COVID, before you step away from your computer, it can be a good idea to instant message your team so that they know that you won't be available for a little while. so that if someone reaches out and doesn't get you, they don't make the assumption that you're taking a nap or sitting on the couch eating bonbons when you should be working. In fact, getting in the habit of regularly communicating can actually build a sense of confidence or reassurance about who you are as a worker. So if, for example, you do accidentally step away from your computer and forget to tell your team, they'll default to thinking, oh, something unexpected must have come up. I'm sure I'll hear from them soon, rather than having an anxious response or assuming something negative about your work ethic. But with all of that said, what's really essential to remember as you're thinking about communicating strategically is that you do not have to be a completely open book about everything going on in your life. And significantly, it's critical to know that generally speaking, you're not required to provide provide information about your health or your health history to your employer, whether it's a current employer or a prospective employer, nor are they allowed to ask. Now, I did say generally speaking, there can be situations where you might have to share some information in order to, for example, access your rights under the law. There might be other reasons why you want to disclose, and we're going to talk about that in a couple of slides. But first, I want to quickly touch on why effective communications are also important in looking during a job search. So first, clear communication is absolutely key to opening the door to potential interviews, whether that's through networking or a cover letter or a well-constructed resume or CV. What it boils down to is using these communications to help people understand what kind of job you're looking for, who you are as a worker, and what it is that's bringing you to the table. It's also the case that most pre-interview communications, like the ones that I just listed, involve making the best possible use of a limited amount of space, sometimes a very limited amount of space. Cover letters shouldn't be more than a few paragraphs. Both resumes and LinkedIn profiles should be succinct. And in networking, it's smart to know how to very quickly share details in real-time conversations so that you don't lose the other person's attention. Now, all of these things require planning and specific skill. And then in terms of interviewing successfully, your overall goal, no matter who you are or what job you might be interviewing for, is to communicate in ways that show the person across the table or Zoom screen that you are the savviest, most qualified candidate for the role that you're interviewing for, which is also a skill and something that should be practiced. And I promise we're going to spend more time talking about that later in the session. But for now, let's jump back to the topic of disclosure, because the decisions that you make about whether or not to disclose anything about your cancer status or how much you share if you do decide to disclose, these can greatly impact what effective communications look like for you specifically. Whether or not to disclose in work or in other areas of your life is an incredibly personal decision, and it's one that requires a lot of thought. I mentioned a few minutes ago that you're not required or obligated to share your health information with an employer, generally speaking. However, we find that a lot of individuals with cancer, understandably, have the question about whether choosing not to share is essentially equivalent to lying. It's a great question. And what I would offer to you in response to that is that if it's a question you have, recognize that the decision to not disclose cancer status is the choice to omit sharing personal information that isn't relevant to if or how you can do the job, right? It's not lying. And if you think about it, there are all sorts of pieces of personal information that people choose to omit in work setting. For example, no one ever goes into a job interview and says, I chew gum all day, and when I'm working, some of my past coworkers have found that really annoying. Similarly, people also experience all sorts of medical realities they don't share with their employer, such as diabetes or heart disease, or if they take birth control or antidepressants, right? Omissions are okay, they happen all the time. So the choice of whether or not to disclose can come down to how you personally feel about sharing. Additional considerations include why you want to share. Is it because it feels important to you to do so? Or is it because you know it's necessary in order to access legal protections. There's no right answer. It's about your specific needs and your specific preferences. It's also typically not an all or nothing scenario. You can always start by just sharing a small piece of information that's relevant and then share more later if something else becomes relevant down the road. But on that same note, it's impossible to unshare something that's already been put out there. So it's often better to start by offering less information. Seeing disclosure as sitting on the spectrum can help you to make the decision of what, how much, and to whom you will be sharing. Additionally, when deciding whether or not to share at work, consider what you know so far. If you are planning a disclosure conversation, it's important to stick to what you know to be true and not necessarily the what ifs. Getting accurate information from your healthcare provider around timelines and treatment protocols can be helpful, but you don't want to give your employer the impression that things are set in stone, because the reality is that circumstances change, often unexpectedly, and it can be uncomfortable to have to walk back a promise that you made early on before you knew how things would play out. Much better to let them know up front that you're telling them what you know now, that the things might change. And if they do, you will communicate that to them. Assuring your employer that the dialogue will be kept open can help to ease some of their concerns about being kept in the loop. We also encourage developing a personal disclosure plan. So this involves making clear decisions about what, if any, information about your cancer journey you're going to share, both online and off, where you're going to share it, think through what is going to work for you, what the potential impact of long-term disclosure is, and then take some time to share out what those preferences are with the people around you. The number of stories that we've heard over the years from people who have been accidentally outed by a loved one who didn't realize that they were trying to keep information about their diagnosis ever under wraps are pretty significant. So consider the fact that we don't know what's going to happen. You might find yourself looking for a job in the future and wish that some information wasn't out there online, even if everything seems okay today, and make sure that the people around you are also aware of what your preferences are. At Cancer and Careers, we also often hear from survivors about the role that the internet is playing in helping them through their cancer experience. For many, it creates a sense of community and a way to feel better in the moment, but it also creates a written record of information that can be difficult to get rid of. And at the same time, research indicates that more and more hiring managers and sometimes existing employers as well are Googling prospective candidates and people who work for them respectively. Usually this is done with the best of intentions. Hiring managers do it because they like someone on paper and they want to find more that they like. Managers are usually looking to learn more about the people who report to them, to try to communicate with them on a human level, not just on a get the job done kind of level. But it can still lead to the discovery of information that their employee or job candidate might prefer haven't been public in the workplace. So I want to be clear that I'm not saying never post anything online, particularly because it can actually be good to have an online presence, but rather that it's important to have an understanding of the virtual landscape in order to be able to make informed choices about how your story is being presented online. We do have an hour-long webinar called Disclosure, Privacy, and Online Brand for those of you who are interested in a deeper dive into that topic. So I encourage you to check that out on our website if you're interested in more. So stepping out of the online space now and back into the workplace. When deciding whether or not to share information about your cancer status at work, there are two major things to consider overall. First, how will treatment interfere with your ability to perform your duties? And as I've alluded to already, what legal benefits are there to sharing this information? We're not going to spend a ton of time today talking about workplace legal protections. We have a number of other resources available where you can learn a lot about those. But I will say that it is sometimes necessary to share some information about your diagnosis in order to access protections of the law. Under the law, again, we have lots of webinars and articles on our website where you can learn more about that. But it is important to note that many people often want to disclose for reasons not having to do with the law. Some people are sharers and it just wouldn't feel natural not to share. Other people may find themselves working in a workplace where they know that someone has gone through something similar and they received a degree of real support that was helpful and beneficial. And so they feel very comfortable sharing personal information. But other people might feel differently. It can be incredibly valuable to think about what other people in your workplace might have been through, whether it was maybe not someone who went through a cancer diagnosis, but perhaps someone who went out on maternity leave, or a person who's taking care of their aging parent and is getting a lot of support. So think that can factor into the choice of whether or not to share. We also get asked a lot, who should I tell? That's going to vary a lot depending on specific circumstances. It's also possible that you might find yourself having to have more than one disclosure conversation. So if that's the case, we recommend starting with a person that's going to be easiest to talk to, and then going from there. For many people, it's a supervisor with whom it's easiest to have the conversation, because that's someone with whom they already have a lot of ongoing conversations. But it's important to remember that not all managers are trained to be managers. Sometimes we hear from people who have received a cancer diagnosis and they go in to talk to their manager about it, and they find that both of them on both sides of the table are having this kind of conversation for the first time. And at Cancer and Careers, we recognize this as a need. And so we developed a manager's kit, which is designed to actually be taken into these conversations. You can hand it across the table to your manager to help them kind of understand what their responsibilities are, what some practical tips are that might work for you. So I would encourage checking that out on our website. It's linked at the bottom of this slide. Some people will go to their HR department to have these conversations. Sometimes it's going to be required that you start with HR. That would be written in a policy handbook. So it can be a good idea to take a look at those and see if that's the direction to go. But perhaps the most important thing to remember in any of these disclosure conversations is, again, to incorporate the idea that it's going to be fluid. We mentioned that on an earlier slide, and it really cannot be emphasized enough. Help people to understand that what you know today is what you know today, and that it may not apply next week or next month, but you will be there for the ongoing conversation and working with them to find solutions that are going to work for everybody involved. Now, when thinking about whether or not to disclose or whether to share, it's important to know that physical changes can sometimes communicate information as well. Remember, we talked about unconscious communications in the very beginning of the deck. We talked about how behaviors can sometimes give clues, and physical changes can as well, such as hair loss or weight loss. They might invite questions. So we bring this up as part of our conversation about communicating effectively, simply to underscore that if you are somebody who is choosing not to disclose widely, but your team is also telling you that there may be some changes to your appearance, or even some just changes overall. Fatigue, when it kicks in, that can be a noticeable thing too. You seem tired, you're not volunteering for as many projects as you might have in the past. That all can invite questions. So if you know these things are possibly going to happen with your treatment, side effects you may be experiencing, it can be a good idea to plan for any questions you might be asked and have a sense of how to respond. So with all of that said, if you do decide that you're going to disclose at work, the idea of simply getting the ball rolling is one that can be intimidating for a lot of survivors, and that's really understandable. So on this slide, we've given you a couple of examples of how you might start the conversation. For the sake of time, I'm not going to read through them. But overall, what's important to know is that when you're preparing to begin these conversations, be sure to weave in the idea that you want to collaborate with your employer to create a plan. Figuring out ways to incorporate that you're thinking about their needs, not just your own needs, but their needs and the needs of your team and that all of it's being met, that can go a really long way when you're jumping into these conversations for the first time. Also, if the exact language on this slide works for you, please feel free to use it. It is yours. But the reality is that the exact same language isn't going to work for everyone because, as we said earlier, not everyone communicates in the same way. So a critical part of this is making sure that anything that you plan out in advance incorporates language that sounds like you and that you feel comfortable saying. In fact, how each of us goes about communicating, because it can vary so much from person to person, is really because it's influenced by a variety of factors. Individual factors like personality, cultural background, the way we were raised, whether or not the language that we communicate in is our primary language. So many factors can be incorporated. And the way that a specific person expresses information or ideas is referred to as their communication style. Very important to note that there is no one communication style, and a good place to start figuring out what your individual communication style is to ask yourself what your feelings are about sharing. I mentioned this earlier that some people are sharers. So knowing if you have started thinking about what your particular feelings on sharing are, you have already started thinking about what your personal communication style is. And when we think about communicating at work, again, important to evaluate your workplace culture. Is the environment like a second family where people joke around and share details about their weekends and their families? Or is the tone more corporate and buttoned up and laser focused on the task at hand? How does this impact the way that you communicate or don't communicate at work? Does it impact your feelings about whether or not you want to disclose? Additionally, understanding your own communication style can help you become a much more effective communicator because it helps you to truly own what your strengths are, as well as to be aware of places where there's room for improvement and other things that you should be on the lookout for. And of course, it can't hurt to also be able to recognize characteristics of the communication styles of the people around you. Now, in case any of what I just said above was confusing, we are going to spend the next few slides going into more detail with a specific model that we're going to look at. Now, excuse me here. Flip forward and then flip back. There we go. So we're standing there. So, okay, as you imagine, a number of career coaches and other business professionals have done some really good thinking and research into communication styles. And among them is a man named Mark Murphy. He is an author and a leadership coach who has developed a model that outlines 4 primary communication styles. And I want to emphasize before we go any further that he is one person. We are with one model. We are going to talk about his model because we think that it is a great example of and a great framework to start considering all of these things, but there are others, and I encourage you to go to your library, go online, and to read about other communication styles and models if you're interested. But back to Murphy. In talking about his 4 styles, Murphy says that there are 2 major philosophical differences in terms of communication style. The first is that people tend to communicate either more with emotion and feeling or more with data, numbers, and facts. So, for example, if we think about 2 people who work in an animal rescue, a more emotional communicator might say, I feel like we're doing really well with our winter adoption push. Whereas a more data-driven communicator might say, 92% of the dogs we're currently fostering have received adoption applications. Both are saying something similar, but exactly how they are saying it is different because of their different communication styles. The second difference has to do with the arc that people use to communicate, to convey information. So do they go in a straight line, A, B, C, and then so on? Or do they share information in a more roundabout way? They tell kind of looping stories. Do they skip details entirely? Some people certainly characteristic of their communication style. So we're going to walk through Murphy's 4 communication styles. But again, before we do, reminder that none of these is correct. There's no one style that is better than the others. And I encourage you to think about which ones resonate with you, ones that resonate in terms of who the people you work with are, who the people in your personal life are, and how you might use that. So the first communication style that Murphy identifies is the analytical communicator. This is a person who uses facts and data to communicate, so they are not that emotional communicator. They use specific language, and they tend to express themselves logically, or in that straight A, B, C line that I was just talking about. So those are their strengths in terms of how they express themselves. On the other hand, some things for analytical communicators to be aware of include coming across as being cold or unfeeling. Sometimes analytical communicators can get stuck in their head and they can seem maybe a little robotic and like they're not emotionally engaged. It's also not uncommon for people in this group to find themselves getting frustrated with someone who is less detail oriented or less number driven. And so that often means that they'll come across brusque in their replies. They might even stop paying attention. And that can impact how effective communication is as well. So if you recognize yourself in this description, these may be things to monitor, to work on. And of course, another point to keep in mind if you're an analytical communicator is that it may be challenging for you to talk about some of the unknowns that come with a cancer diagnosis and treatment. Because as we've been discussing, cancer experience is fluid and it doesn't always move in that straight A, B, C line. So keep in mind that your strong ability to be logical and apply numbers might not be of service here. Next, we have the intuitive communicator. This is someone whose strengths include both being able to describe the big picture succinctly and also cut right to the bottom line without giving a lot of detail. And that can be very effective in certain work environments. That said, if this describes you, keep in mind that you might come across as impatient to others who do require detail. Some people that's how they imprint information, is through the details. So whether you're getting they might need that in order to really absorb what is being shared with them. We also, as we think about how this might impact workplace communications during cancer, it's important to know that there are times where a lot of details are necessary. So for example, if you're going to be out for a few weeks for surgery, say, and a coworker is going to cover a project while you're out, handing it off to them may require that you really unpack the individual steps and components to make sure that they understand all of the moving pieces and parts of how to successfully do the things that you need them to do. So remember that last slide I mentioned people who really appreciate receiving detailed communications? Well, Murphy calls them functional communicators. And it's not necessarily the fact, data, number kind of details that our analytical communicators like to use. Functional communicators like the kind of details that are required for planning in advance. They tend to communicate information in a very step-by-step way, and they are often sought out for their exceptional strategizing and organizational skills. However, if you fall into this category, you'll want to make sure that you're sharing just the right amount of detail, not too much, because if you do so, you can risk losing people's attention. Functional communicators should also be mindful of oversharing during disclosure conversations. A helpful tip is to really plan for those discussions by writing down everything that you might want to say, and then going back through to edit out details that aren't totally necessary right now if you want to err on the side of sharing less today, but knowing that you can always say more later. The fourth of Murphy's communication style is the personal communicator. And this is the group that most frequently uses emotion to communicate, which means they are strong empathizers. They listen well and they're diplomatic, all of which are very challenging skills to teach. So wonderful traits to come by naturally. Plus, being emotional in a work context can be a positive. For example, feeling passionate about your work and letting that shine through can actually strengthen your communication. On the other side of the coin, personal communicators will want to be mindful about letting emotions overtake a conversation, particularly heavier emotions. So it can be a good idea to write out notes or sort of script for yourself to keep you grounded during disclosure discussions in case feelings start to build up. At Cancer and Careers, another thing that we hear frequently is concern that many survivors have that having shared their diagnosis, they will always be seen as the cancer person in their workplace. And this is understandably both distressing and frustrating to a lot of people, often leading them to wonder if there's anything that can be done to help shift coworkers' focus so that they can start to see that survivor again as the full and robust person they are with tons of skills that they bring to a table in a work context. And the answer, of course, is yes. And so what we see on this slide is a verbal technique that we recommend at Cancer and Careers that can be helpful in addressing cancer-related comments that might come up, or if somebody's asking questions about how you're feeling after a treatment and you don't really feel like talking about it. Using the swivel can help you kind of take back control of that conversation and move it over to another topic. So for example, in this at the top of the slide, you'll see this comment that we hear getting made, or some version of it, a person saying, my uncle had cancer. Well, you might swivel out of that by saying, I'm really sorry to hear that. That must have been very difficult. And while I have you here, what did you think about the meeting that we had yesterday? I would love to pick your brain about X, Y, and Z. And you just drive the conversation in another direction. People tend to pick things up from where they were left off, pick up conversations from where they were left off. And so that is a great way to indicate and take control of where you feel comfortable expressing yourself. Similarly, I think something that's often hard for people to recognize, particularly people who want to be viewed as valuable employees, is that everyone has limits. And it's important to take the time to figure out what yours are and what triggers them, especially while juggling both work and cancer treatment and recovery. In our personal lives, it can be easier to tell people that we need space or to be left alone. But work culture often makes that hard to do, which means that it's critical to find productive ways to communicate your limits. Learning to set these boundaries on the job might enable you to decline certain types of requests, such as staying late for non-essential tasks or being given new jobs to complete. And although it can be difficult to say no, figuring out how to do it can help you become a better employee. You won't be overburdened with extra work, and you won't feel trapped by every ask that you receive. And at the bottom of this slide, you will see a link to an archived webinar that we did on specifically focused on setting boundaries. It's a full hour long. So for more on that, please do check out the archived webinar. So the key, of course, to setting effective boundaries in the workplace is crafting language that feels natural and communicates the no message in a way that still feels professional and team oriented. So again, we've got some examples on this slide, and I'll leave you to read them. You will notice that they involve expressing gratitude and then sharing an explanation that is rooted in being human. It could apply to almost anyone in the workplace. And this can be done rather than giving an explanation that's rooted very specifically in the cancer diagnosis, right? I'm a bit swamped this week and I'm concerned about my ability to get this back to you in a timely manner. Who hasn't been there, right? And again, social workers can be particularly useful in helping you to come up with language that works for you and to help you practice saying it. And then, of course, there are a whole spectrum of comments that you may encounter in the workplace. One we have on this slide falls into the category of the well-intended but off-putting. Again, I will leave you to read this on your own and recognize the key is to find language that's relevant to your circumstances, that sounds like you. And I guarantee you will get better at swiveling the more you practice it. Another area around which we've seen a lot of dialogue in the cancer community is the use of data language when discussing the experience of going through cancer treatment. And I do want to be very explicit in saying that in no way am I implying that using fighting metaphors is inherently bad. If that is a concept or language that resonates with you and works for you, then we are all for that. But we know that it doesn't work for everyone. In fact, I've met quite a few survivors over the years who find it very upsetting, and that is also valid. And for them, it can be very jarring when someone else assigns that language to their own personal cancer experience, particularly if it is a coworker that they do not know all that well. One of the things that we believe very strongly at Cancer and Careers is that each person should be in charge of their own narrative and how their own story is told. So to that end, how can one address it in the workplace? If a coworker says something along the lines of, I so admire how you are battling your cancer, and I think that kind of fighting spirit is so critical to feeding it. Well, one approach might be to swivel and say something like, thank you for appreciating how challenging it can be to balance everything that I have going on. And while I have you, the budget recommendations you provided need to be tweaked slightly. This approach drives the conversation back into the realm of work-related topics without having to engage directly with the battle language that was used. And while this approach is going to work for some, others might prefer to take a more direct approach and make it a teachable moment. So saying something like, thank you for appreciating how challenging it can be to balance everything I have going on. I can understand why you think that mindset and attitude are so important to navigating cancer, life, and work. But I do want to share that while for some people the battle language is very inspiring, for me, it actually is not. So I'd be grateful if we could talk about my experience using less loaded words. Again, this is an approach that is not going to work for everyone. So if you do decide to take it, it is important to be open to the idea that it may invite further conversation, which requires you to provide further guidance to your coworker. Or it may create a situation where you leave that person to absorb what you just said. It's also possible that you will get another response entirely. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that you'll want to be comfortable managing whichever reaction you might generate and be prepared for the fact that should you choose the teaching moment route, you might generate a reaction. So the comment that we've shared on this slide falls into the category of what we call the outright insensitive. And you can see the possible response we have included here is pretty substantive. So again, for the sake of time, I'm going to leave you to read it on your own. But what this slide really drives home is the idea that it can be useful to sit down and think about how you might personally respond if someone were to make a comment like this to you. You don't want to find yourself caught off guard in these moments. People can have really emotional reactions when they're caught off guard and subsequently find themselves saying things that they wish that they hadn't. So here we're really trying to arm you to be prepared. Preparation, just a little bit of preparation can go a very long way in these moments. Now, turning to the topic of communicating during a job search. This is a question that comes up frequently. This question of, should I disclose my cancer history in a cover letter or a resume? People often want to do it as a way to explain a gap in their work experience or even as an example of their skills. And what I will say is that ultimately your job search is yours and it is up to you to conduct it in a way that feels right for you. However, I encourage you to think about it this way. Every job search really amounts to a series of conversations. And it's wise to think about the purpose of each of these conversations and then to think about where in the process disclosure might make sense. We're going to take a deeper dive into the nuances of what this means, but I also want to call out that we have a publication called our Job Search Toolkit, which is incredibly helpful. It has a ton of information. And we also did 4 webinars on jobs related to looking for work this year, and those are archived on our website, brand new in 2021. So you can go check those out as well for really more intense deep dives on the topic of job search. But let's start now here by talking about resumes. So what's an effective resume? Well, simply put, it is written with a specific audience in mind. That means that you may have different versions of your resume to apply to different jobs. And because different jobs often require an emphasis on different skills, which you may have all of. It should be a succinct summary of capabilities and accomplishments. In fact, it should be made up of about 80% accomplishments. Additionally, it should be easy to read and understand. Be visually appealing, meaning it's not too cluttered with white space visible on the page, and it should be an easily readable font such as Arial or Times New Roman or Helvetica. And also use a style that is professional and has impact. Stay future focused instead of regurgitating everything that you've ever done at work, and keep the target towards your future career goals. I'll also mention that we have a free resume review service at Cancer and Careers, and so you can upload your resume there for tips on how to have your best resume in hand. Now, when it comes to cover letter, I think the two best pieces of advice are don't just reiterate everything that's been said on your resume. This is your opportunity to use prose, to draw parallels, or highlight an experience that makes you uniquely suited for the role, and to do it differently than how it's outlined on your resume. And don't use a generic letter that doesn't tie you to the specific company and job. I have read a lot of cover letters in my day, and I'm telling you, it's very clear when someone has submitted a generic cover letter and are just passing along something that they've submitted to other employers as well. And it also really stands out when someone has clearly taken the time to tailor their letter and think specifically about why they want this job that they're applying for. Going back to the question of whether or not you should disclose in a resume or cover letter, what I will share with you is that as much as I wish that it were not the case, there have been some studies done over the past couple of years that have shown that people are less likely to be called in for an interview if they disclose either a disability or their cancer diagnosis in their cover letter. So I wish it weren't the case, but we do know that it does happen. And so what we recommend, if you are interested in sharing your cancer status before you get an offer or before you start a job, we recommend waiting until you've had at least one in-person interview so that whoever is doing the hiring can get a sense of who you are and what you bring to the table in terms of your personality and your humanity, because that human context can help to illustrate that you are more than just your diagnosis in ways that words written on paper likely can't. Now, according to a number of sources, about 85% of jobs are found through networking. So here we've included a number of best practices for communicating effectively while networking. And I will lead you to read those. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on networking right now. But what I will say is that there are so many ways to network. LinkedIn is a wonderful tool. We have an archived webinar on LinkedIn on our website, which I encourage you taking a look at. And I also encourage you not to think about your network too narrowly when you're reaching out to people, and to embrace the idea of small talk as an art form rather than a burden. I know people really have strong feelings about small talk, and some of them are not great, but you know, when you're trying to find work, it is really useful to know how to build a conversation off of something that may seem like a minor detail. It can lead you to much larger concepts and much more important discussions. Also essential to use proper networking etiquette. You know, if you talk to someone for more than 15 minutes, send a follow-up email. Try to use the word you more than you use the word I in those emails. And then if you tell someone that you're going to do something, like send them a resume or forward an article that the two of you discussed, make sure that you do it in a timely manner so that you can build on any good first impressions that were generated. Again, I mentioned that we have a webinar on LinkedIn, and so I'm not going to spend a ton of time digging into that. But if you do not have a profile on LinkedIn, I encourage that you build one. Make sure that you keep communications and posts focused on professional things. Facebook, Instagram, perfectly acceptable to share thoughts on a movie that you might have seen or pictures of your puppy, but keep LinkedIn professional. It is okay to reach out to people that you haven't met on LinkedIn. It's actually kind of expected, but know what you're asking for them, be specific, and know that it is a reciprocal process. Be willing to offer favors, information, whatever it might be, if somebody is willing to help you. Also, be strategic about the people that you're connecting with, right? Don't waste time with people who are not in line with what your professional goals are. And of course, check and monitor your privacy settings on LinkedIn and on any site where you may be posting information. When it comes to interviewing effectively, we do encourage that you prepare beforehand. This should include researching the company and the interviewer before you meet with them so that you can show that you're familiar with the organization and you can make a good first impression. It's also smart to plan and practice potential answers to questions so that you feel comfortable saying them and they sound natural and just roll out of your mouth. It's also important to know that the way that you communicate in an early stage interview may be different to how you communicate once you've had one or two meetings. You know, in early stage interviews, your cancer experience may be front and center in your mind, but it is unlikely to be front and center in the interviewer's mind. So your primary focus in these moments should be focused on describing your interest in the job and selling yourself. And as I hinted earlier, in later stage interviews, be strategic. Be strategic about disclosure if it feels necessary. Wait for moments where it feels organic. And then don't be surprised if whomever you're interviewing with doesn't ask you follow-up questions. Because as I mentioned before, potential employers are, for the most part, not legally allowed to ask you about your health. And if the person that you're chatting with is aware of this, they're probably going to want to move on to a new topic very quickly. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they're a discriminatory person or that, or that they're uncomfortable overall with working with someone who has a cancer diagnosis. It may just be that they know that they legally can't talk about it with you. And so they're just trying to keep things moving. Also, think about being strategic about when you ask about benefits and things like that. It's on the front of a lot of people's minds, but it's typically best practice to wait until after you have an offer on the table so that the person you're interviewing with doesn't think you're only interested in the benefits. While we're on the topic of interviewing, and I am mindful of time because we're about to hit the hour according to my clock. While we're on the topic of interviewing, I do want to touch quickly on virtual interviewing. And I will also say that we have been building out our website with a lot of information since COVID started about working virtually and interviewing virtually. So it is there and available. It has become more standard practice for people to interview for jobs virtually during COVID. And on this slide, we've listed out some best practices that can be used as kind of a checklist if you're getting ready for these interviews. Test your technology in advance so that you know that you're comfortable using it. Set up your camera or your laptop in a way so that there's a flattering view of you. Keep your head and shoulders both in the picture. Dress as you would if you were going to an in-person meeting. A lot of career coaches recommend that even though you could wear pajama pants when you're doing a virtual interview, they recommend dressing head to toe like you are in person, because that can come through in terms of confidence levels. And then also take note of what appears in the frame behind you. And pick an appropriate virtual backdrop because, of course, that says a lot about who you are too. You want people to be focused on you and what you have to share about the wonderful skills and talents and passion you bring to the table, and not the leftover lunch that you didn't have time to throw into the dishwasher. So People also express a lot of concerns about their cancer status being brought up in an interview. And so there's another opportunity for you to swivel in these moments. And we've got two examples of what a swivel might look like should you be asked about a cancer diagnosis during an interview. Again, feel free to reach out to social workers. You can also send us an email at cancerincareers@cew.org. And I'm going to put my contact information up in a second. We're happy to help you think through what some of your personal swivels might be. And that brings us to our final slide. I think we have a couple of minutes for questions, and I do see that a couple came into the Q&A box. Our top takeaways: effective communication can be an important tool, whether working during treatment or looking for work. Understand your communication style and others. That can go a long way in helping to improve your workplace conversations. And also thinking through disclosure decisions and how they may impact workplace communications is important. So we do have one more webinar coming up in 2021. We will be posting our 2022 webinar schedule very soon. And also wanted to alert you to the fact that we will be doing 3 full-day conferences in 2022. Our registration for our Midwest conference is currently open. So if you are interested in joining us for that full day, please go sign up. We've got some additional resources here on employment rights and legal assistance. As promised, that is my contact information. If we don't quite get to the questions that you have to ask, or if you need to go because we did hit the hour mark, I'm so sorry, and thank you for bearing with me. And I'm going to put the CEU requirements back up there for those who need it, while we very quickly, while we very quickly answer these 2 questions. The first question that came in, both of these questions this year about disclosure, actually. So someone has asked, should we remove that information from our social media profiles if we do not wish to disclose it? I think the answer there is maybe. That's up to you. If you are truly concerned about it and you want to make sure that nobody comes across it, deleting prior posts can be a really good idea. Keep in mind that if someone else shared a post about you, yes, you can see the resources slide again to the person who just asked that. There it is. If somebody shared a post that you made, the post may still exist somewhere in cyberspace, even if you delete the post on your timeline, so know about that. The other option can be to strategically post other things so that it moves further and further down your timeline. Most employers who are Googling are going to look at maybe the first page of results, or certainly the first page of results that they get back. Maybe they'll go to the second page. They're probably not going to scroll 5, 10, 16 pages deep. They just want to get a general sense of who you are. And like I said, they're typically looking for information that they want to see. So stacking your posts so that you're calling attention to aspects of your personality that you want to show off can be a really smart strategic move. And there is a webinar that we did a couple of years ago that's called Using Social Media to Tell Your Best Story, which was done by a communications and branding and social media guru. And that is up on our website, so you can go check that out for more tips on how to use social media to tell your best story. And then the final question that we have here is, why would someone want to disclose a history of their cancer? What would be the point of doing that? And that's a great question. So for some people, it doesn't cross their mind at all. And I think what we see here is a really clear example of how sometimes people feel very strongly that that's just not information that they want to share in a work setting, or a job interview. But someone might want to disclose a history of cancer. Well, if we're talking about in a job search, as I mentioned, a lot of times people want to share it because it contextualizes why there's a gap on their resume. There are other ways to contextualize a gap in their resume that can also be true, right? So you may have left a prior position because you really needed time for cancer for treatment and you were in a position where you didn't have to work and so you took the time. But it might also be true that you weren't really loving that job so much anymore. And so it kind of created this opportunity for you to think about what may make you happier in terms of work. Focusing on that side of why the gap exists could be a choice. Other people might feel that it really personally impacted them and changed who they are. And that is, and they feel, I've spoken to many people all across the United States who feel very strongly that after what they went through with their cancer treatment, they don't want to be in a workplace with people who don't know that they bring that to the table and that that's part of who they are. I remember I was in Alabama in 2014 or 2015 for a Cancer and Careers presentation. And there was a woman who told us a story about how she was about to get a job offer. And she also knew that she was starting treatment the following week. And she didn't have the offer yet, but she felt like the interview process was going very well. And she had a moment where, because she felt like she was connecting with this person, she felt like she wanted to say to him, like, listen, you're a small business owner and you're really looking for someone who can get their hands in and help you. I think I'm a great person to do that for you, but you should also know that I'm about to start treatment for cancer. And I don't know how it's going to impact me, but given the needs that you have and given what you're looking for, you know, I would hate for you to hire me and then so suddenly discover that I can't live up to what I know I can bring to the table when I'm healthy, but we don't know what's going to happen, that kind of thing. And the person she was interviewing with actually responded by saying that he was so impressed by her character as somebody who would share that with him, that he already liked her. And now he liked her even more because she was exactly the type of person that his wife had been through something similar and that they would make it work. And so it worked out in her favor. So what I love about that story was that the woman who was interviewing had a moment where it felt right for her to share. And she kind of got the sense from the person in front of her that that whatever happened, like they would receive the message in a way that would be okay, even if it meant that she didn't get the job. And so she did, and she shared, and it actually ended up working out for her. So in response to the question of why would someone disclose their cancer history, there are a variety of reasons. Those are just a few of them. So what I will leave you with is, again, a reminder that however you feel is valid. If you feel you do not want to share, that is valid. If you feel that you do want to share and you want to just be an open book, that is valid. Anything in between those two as well, right? It's about knowing what works for you, owning that, and owning your strengths as well. So on that note, we are at 7:09 on the East Coast where I am. And I am going to close it down because I know we're about to lose our closed captioner. So thank you so much for coming. If you asked a question that we haven't gotten to yet, please do feel free to send me an email. I'm going to put my email back up on the screen right there. And again, thank you all for coming. I hope you all have a terrific afternoon or evening, wherever you might be. Thanks a lot.